On the defence file, I know you spent the last couple of days with the Deputy Minister, with Chief Defence Staff, with their deputies getting briefed up on the file, and there is a lot to take in. But I do want to talk about the state of Canada's military. Some people have at times called it a crisis when you're talking about recruitment, about staffing numbers, about procurement, about the actual funding. And so 2% is a number that we've talked about for frankly, decades. It has been the NATO target. It is now the NATO floor, 2% of GDP funding. Is there any prospect that Canada will get there? And I asked that question in the context of, we just had a U.S. Senator on yesterday saying Canada's getting slammed inside the U.S. Senate, getting slammed by allies. Is there any prospect that we actually will get to a 2% floor for funding?
And David, just to be clear, the Prime Minister just most recently, a few weeks ago in Vilnius, reiterated Canada's commitment to the 2% target that has been established in NATO. And there's been a significant increase in military spending, appropriate and necessary increase in military spending in this country. We are not yet at that target, but we have made very significant investments and will continue to do so.
Will we get to 2%?
Well,
are we on that trajectory?
I think we are on a trajectory, but I think it's equally important that we make strategic, thoughtful, careful investments. In the context of the current economic and fiscal environment in which Canada finds itself, it is incumbent upon the government to make sure that we make the appropriate investments in the people and the equipment of the Canadian Armed Forces. All of the things you talked about our people, about recruitment, retention, about the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces, procurement of appropriate and necessary equipment. All of those things are very much aligned and tied together. Canada, we've made some very significant progress. We've made, for example, huge commitments to NATO NORAD modernization, to our investments in NATO, and also into increasing, for example, purchasing new equipment, the jets that we're now proceeding with. All of those are significant investments. They establish, I think, a solid trajectory for appropriate levels of investment in the Canadian government, in our Canadian Armed Forces.
So you talk about the situation that Canada finds itself in economically. It's a difficult time economically worldwide, but it's also a risk-filled time. We are in perhaps a once-in-a-generation type of war when we look at what's happening with Russia's war on Ukraine. Canada has involvement in sending money and in helping train Ukrainian forces. But is this not the moment to be spending more on defense, given what is happening?
And David, we are spending more on defense.
But even more.
We have seen, a 40% increase in defense spending just in the last 5 years, since 2017, in our government. We are also on a trajectory to achieve over the next 2 years a total of 70% increase. We are making significant investments. And in addition to the investments we're making in the Canadian military, we've also committed additional significant resources in our support of Ukraine. I think it can be well demonstrated that Canada has been one of the most supportive countries to the Ukraine and will continue to be. For the Canadian Armed Forces have trained nearly 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and that's been important in supporting their efforts. And so we are making significant investments. Canada is also the fifth largest financial contributor to NATO, and we are leading a battle group in Latvia. We've made, the Prime Minister recently announced commitments to raise that to battalion level strength. It's our brigade level strength. It's a very significant investment and commitment that we're making. I think in many respects, Canada punches above its weight. I'd also add one additional context. I'm a former emergency preparedness minister. Literally hundreds of times over the past 5 years, we've called upon the Canadian Armed Forces to help us here in this country. They've always been there for us. They've always responded in support for wildfire and for flood and for hurricane. The Canadian Armed Forces, is important to Canada. It's important to our international obligations. And we know we have to make significant investments in recruiting and retaining, training the very best people.
So let's talk about some of those investments, because you mentioned the battle group in Latvia, for instance. If the Wagner Group or the Russians were to put a warhead onto a drone and fly it at our troops in Latvia, we don't have in the Canadian Armed Forces in our kit the ability to take that drone down necessarily. There has been since 2012 a request for information for remotely piloted aircraft, since 2012. So here we are 11 years later. The Canadian military does not have high altitude drones that it might use to help patrol the Arctic, doesn't have medium level drones that are being used extensively in this new kind of warfare in Ukraine. Why does it take so long to get kit the Canadian Armed Forces needs?
Well, and one of the things that I have been working with since just in the past few days since I'm in this chair, and it builds upon work that my predecessor, Minister Anand, is doing, is clarifying and updating our procurement processes to make sure that, it's important that we exercise all due diligence, we're spending public dollars, and that we spend them carefully, and that we make strategic investments in the Canadian Armed Forces and in the equipment material that they need. But it's equally important that we make sure that those processes work effectively to get the job done.
Do you think they're working effectively now when it takes that long to just get drones, or when you look at the speed at which the Australians are able to build ships for less than we've been able to?
Well, and one of my responsibilities is to continue the important work begun by my predecessors in streamlining those procurement processes. I don't think we should ever remove the necessary and important due diligence that must be exercised, and at the same time, we have to make sure that those processes work most effectively. One of the most important investments we can make, though, is the real strength of the Canadian Armed Forces and the men and women who serve in it. And so there are some real challenges there. We've begun a very active and I think it's going to be demonstrated to be an effective recruitment strategy. We want to get the best possible people into the organization. We want to create a robust, resilient, and diverse workforce.
But we're about 16,000 short right now, and that is a big gap. It's something the Chief of Defence Staff has said. When you talk about the word readiness, the Canadian military's ability to do the very thing that it exists for, he's concerned about its readiness, about its ability.
And I share that concern. We spent a lot of time, actually just today, talking about how we create a greater readiness. How do we improve that gap between attrition, the people that are leaving the Canadian Armed Forces, and recruiting and training new people into the Canadian Armed Forces. They have an excellent plan. They've been working through it, and we also want to make sure it's not just about recruiting and people into the Canadian Armed Forces, but there's transformation within the forces itself, in their culture, in their HR systems, and the supports that they provide to the men and women who come to that organization to make sure that it is a respectful and supportive work environment for them. And a big part of it as well is making sure that they've got access to the best possible kit, the best possible resources, and that they have the tools that they need. In addition to getting the right people and the right training, that they have the tools that they need to do the jobs that we ask of them. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that our procurement processes are effective and get the job done as required. And for example, the investments, we've made real commitments to increase to brigade strength, our current deployment in Latvia. And that involves not just making sure that they have the people, the number of people that are required to reach that, but it really is to make sure that they're battle ready and that they have the equipment and access to the technologies, and that we make those investments in a timely way to support them.
I just want to wrap up our conversation by talking about culture change. One of the challenges when we talk about recruitment that has been identified is many people who would potentially be attracted to work with the Canadian Armed Forces look at what has happened. Sexual harassment, allegations, charges, many, many challenges. How will someone like you, frankly, when you're taking over for a woman, you're an older man, how will you build a relationship? How will you build trust with the survivor community, the sexual assault survivor community within the Canadian Armed Forces and their veterans?
And we will build that together through demonstrating our commitment. First of all, the excellent work that has been done by both of my predecessors in that file, but we're also working with the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces and with the survivors. I think making sure that they are fully engaged in challenging and changing that culture, taking demonstrable steps. So, for example, the Louise Arbour provided the Canadian Armed Forces with 48 very important recommendations, and we've made a commitment that I want to reassure I remain equally committed to their full implementation. There's a good roadmap underway. One of the more important recommendations, for example, was Recommendation 5, in which Justice Arbour had recommended that all sexual assault investigations should be prosecuted not within the military justice system, but in Canadian criminal courts. as of today, 100% of all those sexual assault charges being laid are now being referred to the criminal court. So we're following that recommendation. My job is to make sure that we follow up and that we institutionalize those changes. There are a number of other very important recommendations that we remain absolutely committed to, and we'll work with the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, we've talked about the importance. The General's been very clear. We need to attract the very best and the brightest from right across the country. And in my own personal experience, creating a diverse workforce where women and visible minorities, racialized minorities, and LGBT members feel that they are supported and respected and they are in a work environment that they can do the important job that we require of them, those become operationally far more effective organizations. I've had that experience previously with my police service. I've spoken to the Chief of Defense Staff. He recognizes the importance of that diversity of perspective, those diverse voices around the command table is going to make them more operationally effective. Our obligation is to make sure that when we attract those people into the Canadian Armed Forces, that they are respected, that they are treated fairly. And for those who have experienced discrimination, harassment, or even sexual assault, we need to make sure that we acknowledge, first of all, their experience, but then we take the very important steps of reconciliation. An important part of reconciliation is taking the steps that are necessary to make sure that it never happens again.
Minister Bill Blair, it's a big challenge. Congratulations on your new posting. Your work's cut out for you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David.